sort this Wi-Fi out. Okay, sorry about that. Tech challenges again. Using the old-fashioned method of Zoom. That's very. So I wanted to do two things. One is really just Makkeh BePatish on this sugya, just complete a couple of things that we left hanging. One is to finish off last week's discussion about melachot that me'eleha nasis, and the second thing is to talk about Makkeh BePatish with the Oichlim, and then I think we should move on, given that sort of an infinite amount to talk about Makkeh BePatish, but we should move on. So last year I mentioned Rashi on Ayin Daled Amud Beis, who says that the reason why you are potter from an additional melacha when you bake the kli cheref in the kiln is Rashi says, why is there not an additional melacha of Makkeh BePatish? Answers Rashi, because me'eleo hi nigmar, it finishes off by itself. I put it in the oven and it just completes itself. Now this Rashi is interesting on a number of levels. It's interesting because it indicates that Rashi didn't give an alternative answer, which is that there's another melacha happening and it can't be two melachas at once, that we've discussed. But in addition, Rashi saw it in and of in itself is interesting. Why should me'eleo nigmar exclude it from being a melacha? Now, there's a number of sort of ways of twisting out of the implications of Rashi, as it were. This, maybe this is a rule with all melachas. It's a groma of sorts. This doesn't seem to be the case. If you bake something or you dye something, these are all lengthy processes which happen by themselves. You put food in the oven. I mean, we're talking about baking something in the oven. If it can be the melach of bishul or afiyah, why should it not be the melach of Makkeh BePatish? You could draw distinctions, which is that with respect to baking and boiling, the process starts immediately, whereas with Makkeh BePatish it doesn't. So it's possible that there's sort of side ways of evading the issue. But the simplest understanding is that Rashi is saying a new principle in Makkeh BePatish, that Makkeh BePatish is different to other melachas, in that if it happens me'eleha by itself, it isn't a melacha. Now, in conversation with Asha, actually, after the shir, it became apparent to me that I hadn't sort of explained it as systematically as I could. So I just want to revisit this a little more thoroughly. There are, in essence, three. We've come to three models of what Makkeh BePatish is in terms of the core description of the melacha. Model number one is the simplest model, and it's Rashi's model. It's Gemara melacha. Anything which is a Gemara melacha is Makkeh BePatish. Just completing something and bringing it to functionality, that is its own melacha, even if it isn't any other melacha. Model number two is the Rambam, who sees Gemara melacha as an example of Makkeh BePatish, but not the essence of Makkeh BePatish. And a suggestion in the Rambam is that any crystallization or actualization of a Masechet Shabbat, it's the sort of craftsmanship actualized, or the action of the person brought to fruition, which is what makes the melacha. And model number three is perhaps the reason of the Yerushalmi, that any totzah chashuva, any significant outcome, is Makkeh BePatish. Makkeh BePatish is like a capsule for any other big achievement that occurs. So these are the three models of Makkeh BePatish. Now, it's possible that the Rambam and the Yerushalmi mean the same thing. Maybe when the Rambam says it's a Masechet, he means, therefore, it's a significant outcome, and therefore, that's why it's Makkeh BePatish. But it doesn't sound like that in the Rambam, and I think for now it's tenable to think about three models of Makkeh BePatish. The Rambam doesn't seem to say explicitly, it doesn't seem to say the point is that any chashuv outcome is a significant outcome. He seems to be stressing the doer of the deeds of the doer happening and occurring and being crystallized is what's important here. Now, what do we make of the svara of me'eleo nasis, that it happens by itself? So if the melacha is any totzah chashuva, any significant outcome, it's difficult to understand why it should be different to the other 38 melachas. All 38 melachas are specific types of outcomes which are melachas. Bishul is an important outcome, binyan is an important outcome, kaisev is an important outcome, and Makkeh BePatish is an important outcome, and therefore it doesn't seem obvious why there should be a svara of me'eleha who nigmra. Why should it make a difference? It happens by itself. The point is the outcome. I've caused an outcome, that's the melacha. If the melacha is the crystallization, actualization of my action on my input, as per how we're reading the Rambam, you could hear the svara of Me'eleh Nigma. You can hear such svara. It's not muchach. You could say, even if it happens without my engagement, I trigger the process that causes it, it's enough. You could also hear the svara that you need my action being crystallized, and that's the Me'eleh Nigma svara. To the best of my knowledge, the Rambam doesn't mention such a condition. It doesn't say explicitly in Mishnah Torah that this is an exception to the rule of Me'eleh Nigma. Exception to the rule of Makkeh BePatish if it happens Me'eleh Nigma. If you say like Rashi, that it's Gemara Malacha, again, we need to pause for a little bit of thought about why Me'eleh Nigma would make sense. Initially, I understood Gemara Malacha and Rashi to mean that this is another type of Chashuv Totzah. That it's Totzah when something is written or something is built, even though it's not complete. And it's a Totzah when something is complete. That's completion is its own Chashivas, its own significance of results, its own Chashivas in Totzah. In which case, I again don't really understand why Me'eleh Nigma is relevant. But we have to cope with this because Rashi does say Me'eleh Nigma, and Rashi does seem to say that the Malacha melachot Makkeh BePatish is Totzah. So my suggestion last week, my best attempt at this, is that since the Totzah of Gemara Malacha is functionality rather than in essence a change in the physical world, the change in the physical world that's happening isn't important enough a change to make it a Malacha. Otherwise, it would be one of the other 38 Malachas. So it's not the harisha with hafiyah, the binyan. It's not the mechanical and physical change in the structure of the universe which I've achieved, which makes the malacha. What makes the malacha? The functionality of the keli. Now, functionality is a very human concept. I'm using by way of analogy. I'm not suggesting this is a complete comparison, but by way of analogy, in Hilchas Kelim, it isn't the shape that makes something into the keli, into the utensil. It's the yichud keli that makes it into the utensil. It's my setting it aside or dedication or creation of it to be a keli that makes it into something that's makabel tuma or ceases to be muktzah and the like. Now there are radical differences in how we define kelim in different sections of the Torah. So what makes a keli in muktzah is not analogous to what makes a keli in tumah. Nonetheless, they all share a commonality that kelim are about functionality, about human functionality. And I can have two identical structures, one of which is a keli and one of which isn't a keli. If I carve out a piece of wood such that it's a bowl, that's a keli, because I made a bowl. If a piece of wood grows on a tree, bowl-shaped, and gets warped by damp and it eventually forms a bowl appearance, this wouldn't be a keli, because it's a block of wood which happens to have a sort of keli-like shape to it. But it hasn't been. There's no yichud keli. No one has made a utensil is a human need, a fulfillment of a functionality, and that hasn't occurred over here. So even though the exact definition of kelim it varies between different sections of halacha, tumah is more existential and intrinsic in what it defines as a keli. Muktzah is more closely aligned with human need. Nonetheless, all kelim have this aspect of halacha that needs a yichud keli. So I thought maybe in Rashi understands that the malacha of the malacha Makkeh BePatish, which he defines as Gemara Malacha, is when a human being is osek in that malacha. My engagement is a necessary condition of saying I have brought a keli into existence. If I merely pop it in the oven, even though in other halachas that's enough to make it a keli, but it happens me'eleh, there hasn't been an sufficient engagement with the malacha of producing kelim, because kelim are ultimately about a human relationship to an object rather than the sort of external apparatus or external structure of the world. Chatzivas Even again. I mean, you have blocks of rock all over the place. They have no significance. Though I could use them as building blocks until I start using them as building blocks. If I hew a block of stone, then I've imbued that stone with significance, because in the act of imbuing, I've set it aside as an act of creatively bringing into existence a block that I want to use for building. So something around this seems to me to be the svara of Rashi. By the way, and I think this was Asher's ha'ara to me after the share, Makkeh BePatish does sound a bit different to other malachas in its very label, because it's interesting that and maybe this is a ha'ara that I should have noticed and said right at the beginning of the whole of Makkeh BePatish. It's interesting that the malacha is labelled by the specific act of an uman or Makkeh BePatish. Whether you understand Makkeh BePatish to be the hewer hitting the stone off the side of the mountain, whether you understand it to be the hammer blow of the uman on the utensil, whether you understand it to be the hammer blow of the uman on the anvil. In all variants, it's interesting that the name of the melachah is Makkeh BePatish, as opposed to the other melachas, in which it seems to be more about causing an outcome. So the translation of the words zereah or choresh is the causer of zereah or charisha. And when the Rambam lists it, he actually lists them as zereah and charisha. Whereas the translation of Makkeh BePatish is not the causer of anything; it's the action itself. So you do see why Makkeh BePatish seems to be more about the doer than the causation of an action. And that seems where Rashi is coming from. Why, again, we have to ask ourselves on Rashi, where did he invent this rule of me'eleo? And he says that was the thing. Why is it not malacha? Because it's me'eleo and nigma. Where did he get that from? Well, I mean, a source for this is this Gemara itself. Why does the Gemara say that when you bake in a kiln, it's not Makkeh BePatish? So part of the answer to that is, Rashi would say, well, that's evidence for this idea of me'eleo and nigma. He doesn't quite spell it out like that. He seems to understand it. It's an obvious idea. Me'eleo and nigma is an exclusion from Makkeh BePatish. Makkeh BePatish is only when I'm doing something, not when me'eleo and nigma. And the source for this, we could argue, is the language of the Mishnah, which says Makkeh BePatish is the melacha, not. There are actions where the name of the action is mikoyach, the doer, the way I'm doing it, my asek, my involvement with it. State of action is my involvement with it. There are actions where the state of action is the result. There is causing that result is what we mean by the action. Choresh and Zereah and Kotze and all the others, the causing of the result is the nature of the action. Obviously, I need to be sufficiently engaged with this. If I'm completely removed from it, that is grammar, not. As long as it's a direct causation, that would be enough to make me a Zereah or Choresh. Whereas in Makkeh BePatish, you can see why Rashi saw in that Makkeh BePatish. There is no tiksal in Makkeh BePatish. There's no mention in the word Makkeh BePatish of a result. It's all about the doing of the doer. So I think that's a fine ha'ara and indicative of it. Sorry? Correct. It sounds like the Rambam of Masechet Shabbat, but according to Rashi, who learns the malacha is Gemara malacha, he would have to ask himself, why does it call it Makkeh BePatish? And I think his answer would be because, unlike other malachas, it's not when it's me'ileo and nasis.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Eliyahu, you didn't mention at all just now the Minchas Chinuch in source 3, Mitzvah Lamed Beis.
Yes.
That you gave us, where he says v'hasavara lazeh, in his second paragraph, he says the savara is simple. That in the Beis Hamikdash or in the Mishkan, cooking happened with a time delay, and in the Mishkan, Makkeh BePatish didn't happen with a time delay. It happened immediately. And as far as he's concerned, I mean, he calls it savara. I just wondered what you would say about that, because you seem to be looking for something deeper than what the Minchas Chinuch calls savara.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I wasn't going to go to the Minchas Chinuch because of time, but the problem is, and I've mentioned this several times when we've looked at the Mishkan, tying something into the Mishkan it isn't sufficient in and of in itself, because we still need to know what that's telling us about the nature of the malacha, how it makes sense. You can argue anything from the Mishnah. You can say, look, let's say the malacha of Tiksar, carrying. So the Gemara learns the malacha of Tiksar from the Leviim carrying the Keroshim and so on. So, I mean, what halacha should we now add to Tiksar? You're only chayiv if you're carrying Keroshim. You're only chayiv if you're a Levi. You're only chayiv if you've got sands in your feet. Like, not every detail of how things worked in the Mishkan offers a relevant halachic principle in circumscribing and defining what the malacha is. So the Minchas Chinuch's point is a valid point, and maybe that's the source of it. But why is it a relevant point? Not every difference differentiates, and we always need to ask ourselves, what is this telling us about the malacha? So the puzzle, to my mind, still remains: what is different about Makkeh BePatish that may allow Nigma is insufficient vis-a-vis other malachas where me'eleo nigma is not relevant. So I did mention this Minchas Chinuch simply because it's not answering the question I'm interested in. It's answering a different question, which would be what would be a halachic or technical source for this idea. Where did Chazal get it from, or something like that? But Chazal understood it as a svara telling me something about the nature of the malacha.
In fact, simply saying that me'eleo nigmara is the principles of grammar are being applied.
It's grammar like no other grammar we know. Groma means indirect causation. Here it's direct causation. Otherwise, I would always be potter when I put anything in the oven. Right? When would I
just
ever be chayav?
there's a time delay. I don't know.
But you have that with every baking. Unless you go to a distinction that baking is a process, but Gemara also seems to be a process. There is room to be further on this, but to me it seems, Rashi just stating as a principle seems to indicate that the Rashi thought this was something very essential about Makkeh BePatish that didn't need further elaboration. It's just, he's happy just to say it as it is. Makkeh BePatish is different because there's no Meileh or Nigma. Sorry, Jeffrey, we're waiting patiently.
Where we said melachot, the decrease of melachot, whether there would be whether on other melachos we have it would also be a Makkeh BePatish where there was a melachot.
Yes.
So when you have Makkeh BePatish and another melachot.
Yes.
According to the Rambam, I think that was discussion as to whether there's a Masechet within another melachot, whether that would physically have Makkeh BePatish.
I haven't thought about that question. Jeffrey is asking whether there's a sort of a discussion in the Rambam about when you have a melacha being achieved with the Ma'aser Uman, whether it could be both the melacha and the Ma'aser Uman. I haven't thought about it. Would it be an analogous or parallel discussion? It's interesting because at first glance, and I haven't thought about this, you could argue both ways. The raw intuition of a svara of why something can't be both another melacha and Makkeh BePatish is because the totzah, the result, supersedes it, right? If the result is a feel, that's a more specific result than just a vague Makkeh BePatish. And as according to the Rambam, where it's the crystallization of my action, if that's Peshat in the Rambam, then you could argue that it would be both Makkeh BePatish and another melacha. And I'm happy with this argument because there are indications the Rambam indeed would hold that. Many of the commentaries in the Rambam assume that the Rambam belongs to the school of thought that you can have Makkeh BePatish plus other melachas. I didn't mention the Rambam because the Rambam's view is a little less clear. But as I did say, I didn't find a single Rishon who said this svara. Right? This intuition that I came into the sugya with very strongly that it can't be two melachas at the same time, and the Achronim share the intuition like the Sfas Emes. When you actually drill down in the detail, there's no clear Rishon that says it. The Rambam is not entirely clear what we were told, but the consensus of the Achronim is that the Rambam would agree that you can have a melacha plus Makkeh BePatish, and your point is well made, because if the Rambam agrees that it's the crystallization of a Ma'aser Uman, why should that, or an action, why should that not apply with Makkeh BePatish also? Yeah. I'll just conclude this section with a little story, because you should know that this is very, very relevant halacha l'maisa. There is a doctor's WhatsApp group, and it seems there's a discussion on it about putting on, from doctor's WhatsApp group, about putting casts on Shabbos. Now, this is a very fraught difficulty because obviously doctors can do things which are can be mechal Shabbos d'oraisa for pikuach nefesh. However, if something isn't pikuach nefesh and could be delayed several hours without significant impact, then one should do so, certainly if there's a sorry d'oraisa. Now, there are cases where a bone needs to be set immediately, and then obviously the doctor needs to do it. Pikuach nefesh in this context doesn't mean you won't die if your bone's not set, but obviously if a bone isn't set, there's a very significant chance of infection setting in and serious injury, and so on, crosses the threshold of Pikuach nefesh Shabbos. But many cases where a bone needs to be set, it can be delayed several hours. There's no particular rush to do it. It's convenient and perhaps painful, and if you would want to get on with the job, sometimes even the hospital will say come in tomorrow and give an appointment to set the bones. So there's no immediate emergency. On the other hand, for doctors to function in modern hospitals, they can't really say it's Shabbos today and I'll do other things, but I won't set a bone and create a cast. This is a very difficult shaila, sort of balancing the realities of how hospitals are to function with Hilchos Shabbos. So a doctor, actually an ex-convent who no longer lives here, but from myself, asked me what I thought about this. So there's a lot of discussion in the postscript around setting casts, and almost all this discussion is out of date because the technology has changed. So in the past, when you wanted to set a bone, you had to mix plaster with water, which was losh, and then you had to set it around the bone, and then you had to smooth it, which is mamareach. It's really a tour of the whole omud that we've just done. In modern day plaster setting, and then there's trials of the nitty gritty of where, so it's not edible, so it wouldn't be the derice of losh, and you'd have to sort of work through the whole topic. In modern day plaster cast, they have a new technology in which there is it's something that you effectively put a liquid around, you immerse the arm in a liquid, you put in a chemical which affects a chemical change in this liquid and causes it to harden, and that's it, and it sets itself. There's no smoothing. You don't wrap the plaster around it, and there's nothing else you're doing. You're just pouring the liquid. Now the question then comes down to: is it Makkeh BePatish? That's the only melacha that you would have available. And actually, interestingly, it gets down literally to our sugya, because it's me'eleha nigra. You put the chemical in, it causes the cast to harden around the arm. Nothing else is happening. I'm not doing losh, I'm not doing reich, I'm not doing anything at all. All I'm doing is putting the water on, and in a process of a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes of standing still, the cast hardens. It's literally the shaila about me'eleha nigma, and really the nitty-gritty in this detail of to what degree Rashi's me'eleha nigma enters into practical halacha or not. So I'll just share this with you. As literally the last 2 weeks I was looking into this shaila, and I was delighted to see that Rashi's Dima Mokum on this question of whether it would be Makkeh BePatish or not. Now, I want to use the last few minutes just to speak very briefly about Makkeh BePatish with Oichlim. I'm just going to give a tour around the topic, and I don't think we need to go into more detail than that. And I'm going to share a shtickle Torah that is not my own. It comes from contemporary Masechet who writes about this topic. And I just want to share like a vart, which I think is a nice thought on this horror that he makes. So there is a discussion about whether there's Makkeh BePatish with Oichlim. And I hope by now you've seen the Marit Mekomas. I'm not going to go through them. The Biur Halacha discusses this. There's a fish, the kulisai spanin, some sort of fish which gets cooked or made edible by pouring water over it. And according to some ways of learning that sugya, the melachot involved in Makkeh BePatish, because I'm making it from edible to inedible, from inedible to edible. This is discussed in contemporary poskim around pot noodles and the like. So you can avoid bishul of the pot noodles. I don't want to cover the whole of Shas, but just very briefly. Normally speaking, we think of bishul as taking place when either I put something on the fire or when I use a kli rishon or a kli sheni, perhaps. Beyond that, we assume there's no bishul. What the concept of kli rishon and kli sheni is beyond the scope of our discussion. There is something called kalei habishul, things which get cooked very easily. And with kalei habishul, even iro kli sheni and perhaps kli shlishim, perhaps kli revi and chamishi and so on, depending on which poskim you follow, hold that kalei habishul applies with kalei habishul, things which are cooked very easily, even if they're cooked with a kli chamishi, the melacha would apply. Now, there's a lot of machlokas about how far kalei habishul goes. Does it extend beyond kli shlishi? And there's a lot of machlokas about which foods are considered kalei habishul. It's a very, very difficult and fraught subject. It needs a lot of clear thought. If you belong to the school of thought that doesn't consider kalei habishul to be a problem with pot noodles, at least when you use iroi kli sheni, and that is what I think. So I think you can pour iroi kli sheni onto pot noodles. Is there another problem over here, which is Makkeh BePatish? Because even though it's not bishul, nonetheless you are finishing something off. So this is the discussion around Makkeh BePatish with Oichlim, a modern variant of that. So again, really very, very topical in Halacha L'maisa. One of the Achronim asks, I can't remember who now at this moment, that the halacha is that you can do bishul b'chama min haTorah. You're allowed to cook something in the chama. It's not a fire, and it's not a normal heat source, and therefore you can cook something in the fire. Why is there no Makkeh BePatish though in that case? Because I'm taking something from raw to cook, and there is no other melacha happening there. So again, it ties in so many of our discussions that we've had now about what's the relationship between Makkeh BePatish and other melachos. There are schools of thought that consider a microwave. There's other reasons you can't use a microwave because of electricity and so on. But is a microwave bishul or not? When a microwave doesn't have a heat element at all. The way the technology of a microwave works is there's a radiation which excites us in the scientific sense. It's not that the liquid in the food gets happy, but it sort of it causes them to vibrate and in fact become heated, and that's how it heats the food. So there's no heat source there at all. It's simply creating an effect in the object that there's a remote around it. So there are a number of scenarios where bishul isn't involved, and yet you can wonder around about Makkeh BePatish. Kulisai spanin, where perhaps even cold water cooks it, so or makes it edible. hot noodles where klish can make it edible, microwave, bishul b'chama. In all these cases, it would be very good to know whether there is a Makkeh BePatish with oichlim or not. La halacha, it appears clear that we do, me'ikah hadin at least, we do not paskin as Makkeh BePatish but oichlin. And there may be a chumrah if you want to worry about minority opinions, but certainly me'ikah hadin, there's no Makkeh BePatish with oichlin. That's a halachic conclusion. The vart I saw in this sefer suggested that the machlokas would depend on the following. There is a general question if we look through everything we've learned in the melachos so far, which melachos don't apply to oichlim, which melachos do apply to oichlim. So, for example, I think we saw by ibud, we saw a discussion about whether yesh ibud oichlim or not. This discussion about severe with oichlim, this is very relevant to halacha. You have to worry when you make rabina or tzid. You have to worry about severe but oichlim or not. There's two, just very briefly, there's two reasons why we would say there's no melach of tzvi of dying with food. One reason is because you don't care about the color, particularly. When you're making rabina, the point isn't that it gets colored, you just want to make the rabina. When you're making tea, the point isn't that it gets colored. But then there's a more profound question: what happens if you do care about the color? So you're making icing or the like, or for halachic reasons, you want red wine, not white wine on Seder night. You add, but you don't have enough red wine. If you take white wine and you pour it in, and then you add some red wine to color the whole thing red. So what happens when you do care about the color? Or you're a chef who enjoys having a plate with multiple colors, and so on and so forth. So there are cases where you do. So do we say that there's severe but or not? And so on and so forth. Many examples. Now it appears that the working discussion around this machlokas, one way of understanding the nidun, for whether there is a particular malacha applies to oichlim or not, is as follows. An oichlim is considered less kosher than a keli. Food is very important, but it's less permanent by definition and less functional than a utensil. So, or other achievements like a field being changed and so on. So an oichel which is less kosher, it appears that melachos which are categorized as a tweak or a tikkun would be, the melacha wouldn't apply to oichlin. Now melachos which are classified as manufacture and making would apply to oichlin. So ibud or tzoveya, which isn't producing but is finishing, which is tweaking and finishing off, the melacha wouldn't apply. Whereas bishul, which is I'm making, the melacha would apply, and so on and so forth. So this is an attempt to weave its way through the sugyas. Again, it's really above and beyond our topic, because you'd have to look at all the melachas where the Gemara discusses this and see if this theory works. But the suggestion that was put forward is that the nidun about whether yesh Makkeh BePatish ba'oichlim or not would really depend on the me'iri and the discussion around that, about whether the melacha of Makkeh BePatish is completion of manufacture, which is certainly Rashi's view, remember glass blowing, and so on and so forth. Whereas the melacha after manufacture, tikkun, fixing up. So you've already separated it from the mountain, you just need to push it over the edge. You've already manufactured, you just need to sort of cut off the hanging threads and the like. And the me'iri suggesting that Makkeh BePatish is only tikkun, not completion. So if the melacha is completion, it would appear misfarah, difficult to say that it shouldn't apply to oichlim, because something new is being completed. If the melacha is tweaking, then it would appear misfarah that you could see why it belongs to the family of melachas, about which Makkeh BePatish doesn't apply to oichlim. I label this as a vart simply because one would have to know a lot of Masechet Shabbat to know if there's truth in this theory or not, and it's beyond my pay grade, meaning I don't know. You have to go through all the melachas and see how this theory fits and so on, and see how it lines up with the views that we've shown him. But for the sake of completion, I just wanted to mention it to you, given that this is something we discussed. For now, I will say that we are moving on to Makkeh BePatish without having finished the topic. And next week on Tuesday, we'll start the next sugya. I would like to finish up to the Mishnah just for the sake of completion. Once we finish up to the Mishnah, I'm tempted to switch to other melachas, but I'll let you know where we go forward from here. I wish everyone a good day.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Absolutely, yeah.